Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Monday, April 16, 2012, and I'm your host, Tony Zhang. Welcome to today's edition of The National. As one of the commonly used pesticides throughout the world in the 50s and 60s, DDT was cheap to buy yet extremely effective at killing insects, such as fleas, gypsy moth, and potato beetles. Agriculturally, it was used to kill insects which ruin precious crops, but it was also used to kill mosquitoes and lice in order to stop the spread of malaria and typhus. Canada and many other developed nations banned the use of DDT in the 70s due to its harmful effect on the environment. But new research shows that DDT is once again being released back into our environment. We now go to our news correspondent Matthew Hu for more on this shocking story.
DDT stands for dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, and it is a synthetic insecticide that is an organic halogen compound. DDT has the chemical formula C14H9Cl5. And its IUPAC name is shown below. DDT was first created in 1874, but it wasn't until 1939 that a Swiss scientist discovered DDT's insecticide capabilities. It was first used as an insecticide in World War II, but in 1943 it began to be mass-produced for commercial purposes. After DDT's ban in 1970s by various nations through the world, it was expected that the insecticide would never affect our planet and environment anymore. However, after the ban, the DDT in the environment became frozen in the snow and ice in the Earth's poles. But with the climate change we're currently undergoing, the ice and snow in the Arctic and Antarctica have begun to melt, thus releasing the DDT back into our environment.
In a study of the elderly penguins in Antarctica, scientists had discovered that DDT levels are actually rising in these penguins. This suggests that DDT has entered into the ecozone in which these penguins live. Scientists are still not sure about how great of an impact the DDT that's been released will have on our environment, and may hope an environment crisis like that from the 60s and 70s will not occur again.
Back to you, Tony.
DDT is a white crystalline powder in its pure form, looking much like table salt. When used as an insecticide, additional substances are added to it, causing the insecticide to be either in a powder form or in an aqueous solution that is sprayed. Yet how does something that seems so harmless have such a huge impact on the environment during the 60s and 70s? With more on this, we have environmentalist Dr. David Suzuki here with us today to discuss DDT's impact on the environment more than 50 years ago. Hello, Dr. Suzuki. Thank you for being here with us today. First of all, tell me, how is DDT made?
DDT is made by reacting chloral and chlorobenzene in the presence of sulfuric acid as a catalyst to produce DDT in water. This reaction can't be classified into a reaction type, but it does show some characteristics of a double displacement reaction.
I see. So, Dr. Suzuki, DDT was cheap to purchase yet effective at killing insects, but everyone knows that it caused many environmental problems. Can you tell us in what ways it harmed our environment?
DDT has such great impact on our environment, and it affected both the hydrosphere and biosphere. In terms of affecting our water, research shows that we can still detect traces of DDT in our water system today, and scientists predict we will continue being able to detect it in certain areas for another 50 years. Also, DDT affects the soil as well, and it stays there for 2 to 15 years, at which time it contaminates any vegetation growing on the soil.
Wow, so DDT sticks around for a long time, huh?
It does indeed. This is because one of the physical properties of DDT is that it's insoluble in water. This means that DDT has a long life in the environment because it's difficult for it to be washed away by rain. That's why we call DDT a persistent chemical.
Can you tell me how DDT affects animals?
First off, you need to understand what happens to DDT when it enters the body of an organism. DDT enters and is broken down into DDE in a decomposition reaction. This reaction involves DDT decomposing into DDE and hydrogen chloride gas. DDE stands for dichloro-diphenyl dichloroethylene.
DDE is more or less the same as DDT, right?
They're both as dangerous and they're fairly similar because DDE is simply a byproduct of the DDT toxin.
So what happens to DDE when it's in the body?
While DDT is insoluble in water, DDE is highly soluble in the fat of organisms. Since all animals have a certain amount of residual fat in their bodies, DDE stays in the body of an animal in its fat for a long period of time. And as the animal is continuously exposed to the DDT source, bioaccumulation will occur, causing the toxin to build up in the organism's body. Eventually, this can affect other animals in the food chain through biomagnification, as the toxin moves up through the food chain in greater concentrations.
Can you give an example of this food chain effect you're talking about?
Sure. Plankton is a microorganism in the water, and it comes in contact with the DDT, causing bioaccumulation to occur. When the fish eat the plankton, the fish now come in contact with the DDT, but the fish have a greater concentration of the insecticide than the plankton did. Finally, the pelican, who's at the top of this food chain, ingests the contaminated fish. Since the pelican is at the top, it will be the most affected by the DDT because it will have the greatest concentration of the toxin in its system. And that's the basis of the biomagnification principle.
Speaking of birds, I've heard that DDT caused a decrease in the bird population. Now tell me, Dr. Suzuki, how did that happen?
When the DDT broke down into DDE, it stopped the birds from absorbing calcium. A huge component of a bird's eggshell is calcium and calcium carbonate. Therefore, the DDE reduced calcium levels in the bird, causing the bird to produce eggs with shells that lack calcium. This means that the eggs weren't very strong, so that when the mother bird sat on them to incubate it, the eggs broke, and the baby bird never got the chance to hatch. This resulted in the low birth rate in many bird species and caused many bird species to be endangered.
Now tell me, which birds were affected the most?
If you recall from my food chain example, animals at the top of the chain had the largest concentration of the toxin. Therefore, the most affected bird were birds of prey because they had the highest concentration of DDT in their systems. Examples of these birds include eagles, hawks, pelicans, and falcons.
Last question, Dr. Suzuki, before you leave. I was just wondering, does the animal exhibit symptoms of illness as soon as the DDE dissolves into the fat?
Generally speaking, when DDE is dissolved in fat, it doesn't cause any fatal problems, as long as the DDT remains in the fat. However, if an animal were to start burning and using that fat, the DDE would be released throughout the organism, and it would attack the organism, especially its nervous system. This is clearly evident in bats. Since bats migrate, they store a lot of fat throughout the year to be used during migration. As the bats begin to use their fat during their migration process, the dissolved DDE in their bodies begin to be released in large concentrations, leading to fatal conditions.
Thank you, Dr. Suzuki, for speaking with us here today. Dr. Suzuki has discussed the environmental effects of DDT. We now go to physician Dr. Oz, who is here to tell us the impact DDT had on humans more than 50 years ago during the 60s and 70s. Dr. Oz, thank you for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure.
So, Doctor, can you tell me how humans came in contact with DDT in the 60s and 70s?
Humans were exposed to DDT through eating contaminated fish, shellfish, or other meat that was contaminated through the biomagnification process. They could have also ingested DDT by eating vegetables that farmers sprayed with DDT.
And how does this affect a person's offspring? I mean, if the mother has high levels of DDT in her body, will she pass it on to her children?
The mother will not pass the DDT during birth or during the pregnancy. However, if she decides to breastfeed her child, she can pass the DDT through her breast milk, and therefore passing the toxin to her baby that way.
I see. And what is the main health concern with DDT in humans?
The main concern is that it affects the nervous system. This not only applies to humans but in animals as well. You see, DDE interferes with the nervous system by stopping the nervous cells from sending electrical impulses. What happens is that the DDE destroys the cellular membrane of the nerve cell, causing sodium and potassium ions to leak out. Keep in mind that a proper balance of sodium and potassium ions between the inside and the outside of the nerve cell allows it to send these electrical nerve impulses. Since the DDE has leaked out the ions from the inside of the cell, it has then disrupted the balance of ions between the cell and its outside environment, and in the end it results in the nerve cell being not able to send out these impulses.
And what effect does this have on the human body?
Since the impulses of nerve cells control the movement of muscles, DDT and DDE cause humans and other organisms to have uncontrollable muscle convulsions or to suffer from paralysis. That's why DDT is linked with numerous neurological problems, in which some of these are fatal.
Aside from these neurological problems, does DDT have any other effects on the body in the long term, perhaps?
Some other illnesses it can cause include asthma, cancers of the liver, pancreas, testicles, and breast, and it can also increase the risk of developing leukemia, lymphoma, and diabetes.
I know that DDT caused reproduction issues with birds, but can you tell me if DDT caused any reproduction issues in humans?
Scientists still can't agree if DDT affected the birth rate of humans during the 60s and 70s, but they can say for certain that DDT caused women to give birth premature.
Thank you, Doctor, for taking the time to talk with us today. DDT was without a doubt a detriment to our environment and planet. And in the 1970s, government and environmental agencies came up with a plan to stop the negative impacts DDT had. With more on this solution to the DDT crisis during the 70s, here's our news correspondent Matthew Wu with what happened more than 50 years ago.
By 1970, more than 1 billion kilograms of DDT had been released in North America. With all the chaos DDT caused in the environment and on humans, many of the developed nations decided to put a stop in their use of DDT. Countries like the United States, Sweden, Germany, and Canada banned the use of DDT in an effort to protect the environment. The belief was that without DDT, animals will slowly recover into their natural ways. So throughout the 70s, countries including Canada began to phase out their use of and production of DDT. By the 1980s, the production and usage of DDT in North America ended. However, in recent years, there has been much controversy over decisions of the UN to use DDT to kill mosquitoes in an effort to prevent the spread of malaria in poverty-stricken nations in Africa. Today, insecticides, herbicides, and pesticides are not the only tested for their effectiveness in killing an insect, pest, or plant, but they are also tested for an impact they have on the environment. Companies aim to create a product which has as few environmental hazards as possible in an effort to prevent the repeating of the DDT crisis. In today's society, everyone is much more cautious about the harming of the environment.
And that is all for today's episode. Tune in tomorrow evening at 6 for another report of The National. Good night.